Since the birth of cinema, independent filmmaking has driven the medium forwards in interesting and creative ways, and this is still true today, despite a far more blockbuster-driven Hollywood landscape. Over the last few decades, the American independent cinema movement has evolved, both creatively and commercially, with the modernization of the movement heavily influenced by one studio in particular, A24. Founded in 2012, the studio began by distributing small-scale independent films, slowly becoming more well-known in the indie landscape. This led to bigger projects, with more filmmakers coming to the studio due to its growing reputation of being a creatively driven place, focused purely on each director's unique vision. As it grew in popularity among filmmakers, so too did it grow among audiences, accumulating a dedicated fanbase, something very unusual for any studio, let alone an indie studio, to accomplish. Because of this, A24 has become trendy, bridging the gap between the artist and the viewer, which creates a far more personal connection to each project they distribute. When defining the meaning of American independent cinema, author Emmanuel Levi wrote that, critic Roger Ebert once said, "It's a film made outside the traditional Hollywood studio system, often with unconventional financing, and it's made because it expresses the director's personal vision rather than someone's notion of box office success." This movement began in the early 20th century, heralding the first major era of filmmaking following the invention of the art form. With the birth of cinema came the birth of the Hollywood studio system, which the AIC movement provided an alternative to for filmmakers who were just starting out or had a lack of funding for less mainstream projects. This idea of discovering new filmmakers through independent cinema has remained to this day as one of the staples of the movement, along with films that focus on a subject that isn't particularly accessible to mainstream audiences. Moving through the decades to the 1980s, a particular studio emerged that would become synonymous with independent cinema, Miramax, founded by Bob and Harvey Weinstein. Prior to this, indie films didn't really have a distinct home, with author Elisa Perrin writing that independent operations faced several challenges in the mid to late 1970s, including the lack of a clear market and the absence of a cohesive community for support. With the arrival of Miramax, this changed dramatically. Films ranging from Kevin Smith's Clerks to Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction were distributed by the studio, providing a platform for the film's and artist's career to grow. However, following the disgrace of producer Harvey Weinstein in 2017, the company became far less prominent, and I believe it's no coincidence that this is when A24 truly began to reach the mainstream, taking over from what Miramax was doing in a way, particularly for young filmmakers. Not only did A24 fill the void somewhat, but it also brought American independent cinema to a much more mainstream audience, effectively modernizing the movement for a new generation at the same time. Within A24, certain filmmakers have emerged, bringing with them a new voice for independent cinema in America. The studio has gained a reputation for filmmaker freedom, allowing creatives to play with different genres in a way that mainstream audiences would be somewhat interested in, but would still be a far cry from most Hollywood studios like Warner Brothers or Disney. One example is the work of the Safdie brothers. Their 2017 film, Good Time, was heavily inspired by Martin Scorsese's After Hours, released in 1985. However, it brought a new frenetic style to the crime genre that in many ways surpasses its influences to create an entirely unique, chaotic tone. Distributed by A24, the film was a major success, prompting the studio to fund and raise the budget of their next film, 2019's Uncut Gems, as well as partner with Netflix, who had seen the success of Good Time. Uncut Gems continues the extreme realism that the Safdies established in their previous work, such as the inclusion of non-actors such as Kevin Garnett and The Weeknd. When discussing The Weeknd's role in relation to Howard, the protagonist, Josh Safdie said, "He brings a reality. What does that do to Howard as a fictional character? It totally makes you think, that's a real guy." This realism would likely not have been achieved in a more controlled studio format, but A24's confidence in the filmmakers made it a reality. By giving the Safdie brothers this freedom, the film became a major success for A24, also due to their deal with Netflix, effectively harnessing the modern power of streaming. This development further encouraged streaming services to take chances on independent cinema, opening the door for the movement to become prolific even outside theaters. Through this, we can see that the unique freedom A24 grants towards filmmakers has resulted in success for both the company and American independent cinema as a whole. By allowing new filmmakers to flourish and develop, A24 is encouraging a new generation of auteurs, able to work at the highest level outside of the more restrictive Hollywood systems. Through all of this, we can see that A24 represents the next step in American independent cinema. The studio has modernized the movement by bringing it to the mainstream and developing a unique fan base, while also continuing the staples of the movement, such as unusual, often personal subject matter, unique takes on genre filmmaking, and funding for projects that would not be supported anywhere else. Author Yanis Tsiamakis wrote that the dramatic changes in American independent cinema in the late 2000s, in tandem with the increased opportunities for independent filmmaking, have brought contemporary American independent cinema into yet another transitional period. The question does remain of whether A24 will be the studio that carries the movement forward through this transitional period, or whether, like Miramax, it will serve as a distinct staple of filmmaking for a number of years before the movement is carried forward somewhere else. Either way, the filmmakers that A24 has chosen to get behind are certainly leading the way in a new Hollywood, showcasing how A24 has bridged the once large gap between mainstream Hollywood and the independent cinema movement.